Here's Francis Ford Coppola in an interview on the Hollywood Insiders program in 1997.
I'm looking forward to really a lot of personal writing for films. I have a big project that I'd love to do. Finally, I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'd love to do that. And I don't feel I've made the film that I really have in my heart. And
what is that? Can you are you at liberty to say?
It's an original screenplay. It's sort of as though it's as original in terms of like the way the conversation was just a story, except it's kind of as big as Apocalypse Now in terms of its scale.
He's talking about Megalopolis, which was just released in theaters in 2024, 27 years after that interview and about 42 years after he first started working on it. In those 42 years, Francis Ford Coppola has talked about this film a lot, to the point that it became somewhat notorious, one of the great unmade films by a great filmmaker. And now, it's here. It's astonishing, really, to hold on to an idea for that long and finally see it come to fruition. Now, this being a film history channel, one with an interest in the sometimes tumultuous moments in Coppola's career, I had to know the story behind his white whale. I dug into biographies and newspapers to learn all I could about the history of Megalopolis in order to prepare myself to actually see it. So, in this video, I'll tell you everything I've learned. Why the film took so long to make, the ideas behind it, the various controversies surrounding its release, and finally, my thoughts on how it turned out. It's not as if Francis Ford Coppola was sitting at home writing Megalopolis like this for 40 years.
Now let's see how it looks so far.
He worked on it in fits and starts, here and there, alternatingly putting it next in his queue before moving it to the side again. He didn't do this out of a lack of interest in the project, he did it because he had to. In reality, the history of Megalopolis is a story about Coppola himself, informed by his own ambitions, setbacks, times of fortune, and times of loss. To understand Megalopolis, we have to understand what Coppola was up to when he first conceived of it. And I'd argue that Megalopolis begins here, at 1040 North Las Palmas Avenue, the home of Zoetrope Studios. Fans of The Godfather probably know all about the creative battles he famously fought against Paramount during the making of The Godfather. They didn't want to cast Pacino or Brando. They wanted it to be set in the 1970s. Suggestions that, in hindsight, feel sinful because we know Coppola's instincts were right, but at the time, to the studio, must have seemed like reasonable solutions to practical budgetary concerns. They're frustrating examples of business stepping on an artistic vision. The history of film is full of instances like that. It happened to Coppola a lot, not just on The Godfather. It happens to everybody. But Coppola, more than most, made it his personal mission to overcome or sidestep the corporate aspect of studio filmmaking.
I don't understand this idea that certain movies can be made and certain movies can't be made. Why can't whatever is alive be made? So I tried to live my life in a way that, for me at least, that would be possible. That whatever I wanted to do, I could. I guess what I'm saying in a sentence is that I tried not to adhere to the rules and try to live by my own rules.
So on the heels of the success of Apocalypse Now, a very chaotic shoot, Coppola purchased a 10-acre lot in Hollywood, California. This would become the headquarters of Zoetrope Studios, his attempt to create an ideal filmmaking environment, a place where artists would be given free rein to experiment, explore new technologies, foster talent, and produce personal projects. No shareholders, no middlemen in suits with feedback that they didn't ask for, just filmmakers coming together like a family to make films they actually wanted to make.
Francis's idea was to try on a small scale to bring back the old studio system, whereby you have actors under contract and certain craftspeople and artists of a variety of experiences, and we all get together in one confined area to make film.
It was, by all accounts, a creative hub unlike anything else in the industry.
You must have a home. You must have a place that says 8 o'clock we're all coming and we're going to do it. And after this picture, we're going to do another picture. And that you are developing new talent and you are making use of the old talent and that it is a community.
Sam Wasson details the lean yet energetic early years of Zoetrope Studios, the lot buzzing with excitement and possibility, in his book, The Path to Paradise. Coppola had more ideas than he knew what to do with. He wanted to pioneer an electronic cinema to plan how scenes would look in advance. He wanted to give his contract employees a share of the studio's profits. He wanted filmmaking legends to mentor up-and-coming talent. He wanted to establish programs for high school students who are interested in filmmaking to receive hands-on training. He wanted to start a theater division that would not only develop acting talent, but also perform for the local community. He wanted to screen his favorite films for the public, free of charge. Some of these ideas never came to be, but amazingly, even in Zoetrope's short existence, some of them did. There really were little kids running around learning how to become filmmakers.
Maybe you could light the candle to show that, that new hope is springing.
This is good.
Filmmaking legends really were hired explicitly to lend their expertise to younger artists. Gene Kelly, for example, was brought on to lead Zoetrope's musical unit, where he mentored Kenny Ortega in choreography. So if you enjoyed this music video or learned this dance as a kid, you might just owe a teensy bit of thanks to Gene Kelly and Francis Ford Coppola. This was, to Coppola, the beginning of a new Hollywood, where artists, not businessmen, were in charge. John Lewis, who wrote a history of Zoetrope Studios, told Variety the larger significance of Coppola's attempt to create an alternative studio in the very heart of Hollywood was that it carried with it the promise of an American auteur cinema, in which the director might someday control the product from development to release. It was, though it might not have seemed so at the time, one of the boldest moves in the history of the movie business. Zoetrope Studios' first project would be One from the Heart, a musical romantic drama about a couple that breaks up on the night of their 5th anniversary. Both head to downtown Las Vegas, where they meet potential partners who seemingly represent everything their previous relationship had lacked. It was a lovely, if unexpected, change of pace from the filmmaker whose extraordinary streak in the 1970s had become stuff of legend. Unfortunately, One from the Heart would not continue that streak. Instead, it would become known as one of the most monumental flops of all time. Rather than film on location, Coppola wanted to recreate the glamour of Las Vegas on Zoetrope's soundstage, ballooning the film's budget from $15 to $23 million. I mean, look at all these lights. Gorgeous. Expensive. This venture might have been possible, but the film's investors suddenly backed out, and Coppola had to scramble to find new money. He tried everything and anything to secure funding, but deal after deal fell through, and no major studio wanted to help the rebellious new artist-run studio in town. So Coppola took out millions in personal loans at an extremely high interest rate, putting up his home as collateral, selling the rights to upcoming Zoetrope projects, even borrowing money from high-profile industry figures like Michael Eisner and Barry Diller, who were sympathetic to his cause. Despite the fact that they barely had the funding to last a week, Coppola barreled ahead with filming anyway.
This notion of me being a risk taker isn't really so true. It's not that I'm a risk taker, it's just that once we're making the film, we don't want to stop, and we sort of, maybe in a naive way, think that, oh, it'll all work out. I mean, we say, let's do the show and worry about it when it's all over.
Yeah.
And that's really how it is. It's the risk part is the least important. We're not thinking about that, we're thinking about the film.
Of course, the studio couldn't keep up with its payroll either. Shockingly, however, Coppola had seemingly cultivated such a genuine spirit of togetherness at the studio that more than 500 employees voted to continue working on the film even though they were not being paid, virtually unprecedented in Hollywood labor annals. After MGM and Paramount both dropped out, Columbia agreed to distribute the film, and a Canadian oil real estate tycoon provided a much-needed infusion of cash. But getting the film made was only the beginning of Coppola's problems. the press had become obsessed with chronicling this saga, disaster by disaster.
A melodrama is currently playing itself out in Hollywood that, for sheer emotionalism, rivals anything put on film. The embattled figure in this drama is director Francis Coppola, who once again finds himself waging a war to keep his dream financially afloat.
And I get it. I mean, what a story. This filmmaker who turned out 5 masterpieces in a row was risking everything, literally, in an attempt to buck the system once and for all. Francis had failed at last, falling from atop his pedestal because of his reckless disregard for the way things are usually done. Coverage was absolutely ruthless. Early public screenings proved unsuccessful too.
How many people did you talk to?
About 14, 15.
And how many didn't like it?
About 13.
And when the film was released in theaters, it didn't fare much better. Critics were unenthusiastic, and the box office receipts were even worse. After 20 days in theaters, it grossed about $800,000 on a $28 million budget. 1982 marked a new phase in Coppola's career. Because all of Zoetrope Studios' resources had been marshaled to create One from the Heart, the film basically had to succeed for the studio to survive. When it didn't, Coppola had no choice but to sell it. It was an extraordinary loss with cascading consequences. His dream of owning and running his own studio had died. His reputation took a massive hit. He told the Boston Globe, "Because I wanted my own studio, I think that was perceived by the majors as a hostile thing. It really wasn't. I really was more enthusiastic than anything else. Nonetheless, when Zoetrope collapsed, I think it was a relief that the example of directors owning their companies and having their own studios went by the wayside a bit." Worst of all, Coppola's financial situation looked dire. Indeed, he would spend over a decade recovering from the tremendous debt he incurred trying to bring One from the Heart to life, declaring bankruptcy 3 times in 9 years. It is in this context that Coppola began to work on the first drafts of Megalopolis. According to Michael Schumacher's biography of the filmmaker, he devoted the first couple of months to 1983 working on Megalopolis, producing 400 pages of notes and script fragments in a 2-month period. The book that inspired the screenplay couldn't have come to him at a better time. Around this time, Coppola read 12 Against the Gods by William Bolitho, which, if you Google it now, is mostly famous for being one of Elon Musk's favorite books. Each chapter basically highlights larger-than-life characters throughout history, like Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Lucius Sergius Catiline, a Roman politician who plotted and eventually attempted to overthrow the Roman Republic, but failed and was killed. That story, in particular, captured Coppola's attention and became the main inspiration for Megalopolis. After all, aren't there parallels between Rome and the United States? The founders read Roman philosophers after all, and hell, they even designed our capital to look like Rome. Historians sure see a parallel. Bolitho begins his chapter on Catiline by pointing out how the similarities between the dying days of the Roman Republic and the United States grow more striking every year. To say that the present United States is the historical counterpart of Rome is too far-fetched, he wrote. To say that it will be extraordinarily like it in 100 years is an intelligent probability. Wait, when did he write this? 1929? And it's 2024? Cool. When most people learn about the Catiline conspiracy, they learn about it from the perspective of Cicero, the great Roman politician and orator who gave a series of 4 speeches denouncing Catiline's plot to overthrow the Republic. Because of those speeches, Catiline has spent a lot of time as a kind of historical punchline, his name being like shorthand for villainous flops. In recent years, however, historians have taken a more complex, revisionist approach to Catiline, and that's definitely the framing Coppola prefers. He explained to Vanity Fair, "I wondered whether the traditional portrayal of Catiline as evil and Cicero as good was necessarily true. In history, Catiline lost and was killed, and Cicero survived. But since the survivor tells the story, I wondered, what if, what Cataline had in mind for his new society was a realignment of those in power. And could it have even been visionary and good, while Cicero, perhaps, could have been reactionary and bad?
How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
I don't know, at least twice a day.
What? Look, I'm not a Roman history person, but even a cursory look at Cataline's story is enough to suggest why Coppola might have identified with it, particularly in the early 1980s. Bolitho described Catiline as ruined. His life had been typical of the fast young society man of the epoch. That is, he had squandered madly, became mixed in several unsavory cases, and borrowed up to and beyond the hilt. The man was in massive debt. Listen to this speech Catiline gave to his followers. Since the government has fallen under the power and jurisdiction of a few, all the rest of us, however brave and worthy, are looked upon by them as a mere mob, without importance or to be reckoned with, and under the heels of whom, if things were right, we should be able to frighten out of their minds. Hence all influence, power, and profit are in their hands, in their gift. For us, they reserve only snubs, threats, persecutions, and poverty. How long now, you high-spirited fellows, are you going to put up with this? Is it not better to die trying to change the situation than to live tamely, putting up with their insolence in a wretched and uninteresting condition of poverty and obscurity? I swear success will be easy. We are young, our spirit is unbroken. Our oppressors, on the contrary, are only worn-out old millionaires. Therefore, we have only to make a beginning, and the rest will come about by itself. Okay, so a man absolutely drowning in debt, who sees the status quo of a system around him as unjust, and who blusters confidently that if they're ambitious enough, they have the power to change that system. Well, who does that sound like? In his book, Sam Wasson actually provides some of the first notes Coppola took about Megalopolis way back in 1983. Reading them, it is truly impossible not to interpret the screenplay as a comment about his relationship with the film industry, with Cataline, or Catalina, standing in for Coppola. Catalina goes to a number of friends who would be in a position to guarantee his loans, and right now, at that time, nobody wants to extend themselves. Slowly, in the course of the film, Catalina literally goes broke and is filled with a tremendous amount of bitterness as to the nature of his debt and how he comes to be stuck with it. The more they consoled him and treated him as though he was not a has-been, the more he felt like one. 10 worst lists, snubs at banquets, cooling bank credit, mistreatment by former subordinates. But he could endure the insults, the professional demotement, the booze and bad reviews. What he couldn't stand was the drying up of money. Rather than be upset about the bankruptcy or loss of his luxuries, he still sees it as a game. And what a wonderful opportunity to see the world from another point of view, that perhaps he's failed so dramatically that designing out of poverty will be the opportunity. Again, this is a story outline for what would become Megalopolis, not Coppola writing about himself. And yet, it is, isn't it? A filmmaker prone to more or less veiled self-portraiture, Coppola has a habit of depicting analogies to his own life in his films. It used to require some interpretation, but more recently he has basically been quoting his own interviews in his screenplays.
And I'm looking forward to really a lot of personal writing.
I want to write something for me, something personal.
Patrick Willems watched his entire filmography and made 2 videos that dig into this topic quite a bit, which I'll link in the description. So Francis Ford Coppola had experienced a significant public failure, a big swing and a big miss, then found a book that seemed to articulate the frustrations he had felt as a singular individual who dreamt of a better way of doing things. And so he began writing. By 1984, he had his first full draft and began talking publicly about the film, revealing plot details to the Los Angeles Times and explaining to Film Comment that the film would have an elaborate novelistic structure. His film would maintain that visionary man versus regressive system idea, but reimagine Cataline's story in modern-day New York City, sort of the way Apocalypse Now resituates Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness in Vietnam, with Cataline as an architect whose attempts to launch the city into a utopian, sustainable future by a mayor who would rather maintain the status quo. Utopia. This word comes up again and again when Coppola talks about Megalopolis. Now, most films that take place in the future or in an alternate timeline depict it as a dystopia. There's no water, the robots have taken over. Nobody seems to have much hope about humanity's future, and it seems like that's been the case for millennia, given that in Greek, utopia literally means no place, nowhere. It doesn't exist. Coppola, however, believes it's time we took the concept seriously. He said, "I want to make a film about utopia, about what it is. It's been ignored. Everyone just laughs at it. We don't even think about it." He defends this pondering of utopia in interview after interview, outlining the kinds of questions he hopes audiences will ask themselves as they consider what the future might look like. I'm trying to say, what's really possible? Do we have to live in this kind of pay-per-view world in which everybody's going to be in debt and a few people are going to own whatever the key resources are? Or are we going to live in a world that is really created by artists and scientists and is just uplifting for people? Because we could. Coppola asked himself these same questions when he created Zoetrope Studios, his utopia. And Cataline would dare ask them too, creating Megalopolis, a utopia for New Rome. That said, Coppola is not a theorist. His ideas about utopia do not have a specific political or economic framework. Most of the time, when he talks about utopia, he talks about a nebulous, vague kind of freedom that relates to his personal experience. The freedom to ask questions, the freedom to do whatever you want, to act without authority figures hovering over you. And you can see where that might be a problem, though, right? Utopia can easily become anarchy or lead to abuses of power without oversight or accountability. Another major inspiration for Megalopolis comes to mind here, H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, which was adapted into a film in 1936. It's one of those rare works that attempts to depict utopia and how we might get there, although, frankly, most of Wells' ideas, well, they definitely sound like they were written by a British person in the early 1930s. Yeah, I'm sure enforcing the worldwide use of the English language will go over swimmingly. British people would know that better than anyone. Anyway, Wells imagines a utopia that emerges through a benevolent dictatorship, a happy society that maintains a very clear hierarchy of leadership, which seems to be the system that Coppola is most comfortable with. Historically, there have been moments under Coppola's leadership where freedom has felt more like anarchy than bliss, where his personal freedom to create conflicted with the needs of a cohesive workplace. And given the rollout of this film, I would argue that we have some very recent examples to add to that list. More on that later. Now, One from the Heart didn't just inform the themes of Megalopolis, it also created a new material reality that affected the film's timeline. After such a high-profile flop and incurring millions of dollars in debt, Coppola didn't have the luxury of producing an epic pet project. He needed money, so he essentially became a director for hire, churning out studio-friendly films throughout the 1980s like Peggy Sue Got Married and The Outsiders that would ideally pose little financial risk. They wanted to have me under their thumb, he said of the studio moguls. Even if he had the money to create the kinds of films he wanted to make, he had to contend with a rapidly changing film industry. The intimate adult dramas of the 1970s were out. Blockbusters were in. Wasson writes, a Hollywood movie of the 80s was no longer just a movie. It was potentially a book, a soundtrack, a Happy Meal, a VHS tape, a television show, a theme park ride, a t-shirt. Thus, was filmmaking per se deprioritized and debased throughout the industry. The oligopoly replaced the auteur. The new watchword was synergy, and the great crafts, Coppola observed, the great traditions were systematically dismantled while no one noticed. All the while, Coppola kept talking about Megalopolis, and in 1989, it seemed like there might be an opportunity to make it. He reached an agreement with the Italian film studio, Cinecittà, to make 2 movies over 5 years, one of which would be Megalopolis, then titled
Le ribellioni di Catilina,
budgeted at $35 million. Coppola hoped removing himself from the American film industry might offer some solace. "I want to be free," he told Italy's Grazia magazine. "I don't want producers around telling me what to do. The real dream of my life is a place where people can live in peace and create what they want." His utopia, you might say. Hope left as quickly as it arrived when, out of the blue, that Canadian oil tycoon reappeared, insisting that Coppola owed him $6 million from the One from the Heart debacle. Once again, on the brink of bankruptcy, Coppola accepted the offer to direct The Godfather Part 3, hoping the film would be successful enough that he could take another look at a script called Megalopolis. The film didn't bomb, but, well, it didn't do very much to restore his reputation or solve his financial problems either, which you can learn all about in this video. Dracula represented another opportunity. Coppola had just declared bankruptcy again, with assets of $50 million against debts of $100 million. If Dracula were a hit, he could make enough money to clear his debts and potentially revisit his dream, an independent movie studio. It was a success, earning $200 million worldwide. Suddenly, Coppola was born again bankable. Columbia signed him to a first-look deal for upcoming projects, which again pushed Megalopolis into the future. The closest he came to filming Megalopolis was in 2001. By this point, a number of actors Coppola initially envisioned in the film had aged out of their roles. For example, he'd asked Matt Dillon during the making of Rumblefish in 1983 to play a West Point cadet, which wouldn't be feasible by 2001. He held script readings with Russell Crowe, Robert De Niro, Nicolas Cage, Paul Newman. Other sources mentioned Kevin Spacey, Parker Posey, and Warren Beatty, though to my knowledge, the film was never officially cast. It had an unofficial budget of $65 million, and to demonstrate his serious intent to actually film the movie, Coppola went ahead and began to film second unit footage in New York City. He captured about 36 hours worth, some of which is included in his wife Eleanor Coppola's documentary, Coda, 30 years later. He filmed all of this. And then, while he was filming in New York City, 9/11 happened. According to Walter Murch, Coppola's longtime collaborator and one of the most innovative editors of our time, this was a fatal blow to the production. You can't make a film about the reinvention of New York without addressing that, and that's such a hot-button third rail of an issue that any mention of it tends to take over the whole film, and that wasn't the film Francis wanted to make. In an interview with Cineast, Coppola agreed the attacks had rendered parts of his script unusable. It was hard to resolve those events in a script about utopia. The script was about a Soviet satellite that ran out of life expectancy, as they do. They just fall out of the sky and crash into the Indian Ocean or somewhere, but in my script, it crashes into New York. A big part of the city was laid to waste, but with a new period of terrorism, none of that story made sense any longer. Not that I had the money or the ability beyond nursing along pre-production. After several years, I abandoned that project and decided I will look at this again someday in the future.
At that time, I was very frustrated. I felt in stalemate with Megalopolis. I've often described Megalopolis as being in love with a wonderful woman whom you cannot have. And so you can't have her, and therefore you don't have her, but she sort of takes the place of meeting someone else, so that you end up, as I was with Megalopolis, just sort of stumped. And I began to think, well, what if I made a film, a less expensive film, sort of the way my daughter Sophia made Lost in Translation?
Coppola wouldn't take another colossal swing just yet. He had a new strategy. The vineyards he purchased in Napa, California, and the resort he purchased in Belize with the profits from Dracula would make the real money and support his family. Meanwhile, he could take small, manageable risks in the fickle, unreliable film business to rediscover his style and get back into writing his own screenplays.
After John Grisham's The Rainmaker, I decided I was going to quit for 10 years, not be paid, and therefore not be able to work with the collaborators I had, and just sort of try to understand who I was and make little, very inexpensive experimental films, which is what Tetro and Youth Without Youth and those were. Those were more for me to learn about.
Right.
that was my period. I sometimes describe it as, like Ozu made a lot of films when he was young that were college comedies, but he discovered who he was when he was old and made these beautiful masterpieces, Tokyo Story being one, but in which he had learned his style. And I was curious if I would learn, if I had a style.
And all the while, Megalopolis lurked in the background, waiting for the moment he could take on a big, ambitious project. In April 2019, on the eve of his 80th birthday, Francis Ford Coppola announced it was finally happening. He was finally going to make Megalopolis, confirming to Deadline that he had a script and had begun speaking informally to potential stars. Funding certainly wouldn't be a problem now. According to Wasson, his wine profits were estimated to bring in just under $100 million per year. In 2019, he supplemented that income by selling a large portion of his wine holdings, the Francis Ford Coppola Winery, wines, and brand names, for an undisclosed fee. After 40 years, this money would allow him to self-produce the film unburdened by the influence of the major studios. And he would need that creative control because it was, as he described it, unusual. It will be a production on a grand scale with a large cast. It makes use of all my years of trying films in different styles and types, culminating in what I think is my own voice and aspiration. It is not within the mainstream of what is produced now, but I am intending and wishing, and in fact encouraged, to begin production this year. Surely, nothing after 2019 could prevent a film going into production. But this time, being 80 years old, Coppola did not have the luxury of putting it on the shelf for another time. He wanted to film it, he could, so he did. By August 2021, things were back up and running, with Coppola eyeing a cast that included Oscar Isaac, Cate Blanchett, and Forest Whitaker. In May 2022, the actual cast was revealed, and filming began that November. On March 28, 2024, Megalopolis screened for about 300 film executives and friends of the Coppolas at the Universal City Walk IMAX Theater in Los Angeles. Immediate reactions were wild. Industry insiders confessed unprompted to Puck News that it was one of the most baffling films they'd ever seen. It's unflinching in how batshit crazy it is. There are zero commercial prospects, and good for him. Distributors, risk-averse as ever, were aware that Coppola hadn't had a commercial success in decades, and whatever they saw in that theater didn't convince them that Megalopolis would change that. No one acquired the film, so it headed to Cannes without one, where it received a similarly hyperbolic reception. Lionsgate eventually agreed to distribute the film, including on home entertainment platforms, so it will likely stream at some point in the future. The controversial screening was the first of a series of unflattering stories about the making of this film that appeared throughout 2024. First came this article in The Hollywood Reporter, which revealed a mass exodus among the crew, leaving the film with virtually no art department, and that Coppola had fired most of his visual effects team. In May, Steve Rose detailed the crew's dissatisfaction with Coppola's unconventional methods and behavior in The Guardian. Many of these grievances seem to stem from Coppola's lack of preparation and inability to communicate clearly. Obviously, I was not on set. I cannot say for sure what went on, though I'm not really surprised to hear any of this because A, Coppola is no stranger to a chaotic set, and B, he's not the kind of filmmaker who wants to make a detailed plan. He wants his collaborators to explore, try things, make suggestions. He wants to let things happen and find the scene on the day. He doesn't always know what he's doing, and he will literally tell you this.
When you're making an unusual movie or a movie you don't know how to make, which is usually what I find myself doing, the movie starts making itself. And you start following, you start saying, well, let's do more of that and less of that. If you know what you're doing, then you just do what you know how to do. But if you don't know what you're doing, which was when I made Apocalypse Now, I had no idea what I was doing. And Megalopolis, I had no idea what I was doing. So little by little, I was following what the film was suggesting.
If personal style conflicts with the industry standard to a degree that crew members are quitting or frustrated, I personally believe that you have an obligation to adjust your approach. I know Adam Driver has defended Coppola, saying that this was his favorite shooting experience, but stars and the crew are not treated the same. Coppola has a history of trying to work around unions, so I'm inclined to believe that he was less skilled with managing their experiences than he was with his leading man. Coppola's behavior was also called into question in a series of articles alleging he had kissed extras in a nightclub scene without their consent. The film's executive producer, Darren Demeter, released a statement explaining that the director walked around the set to establish the spirit of the scene by giving kind hugs and kisses on the cheek to the cast and background players. It was his way to help inspire and establish the club atmosphere, which was so important to the film. Variety later surfaced a video of the offense, but failed to actually speak to the women involved, leading to an awkward situation in which one woman in the video later claimed Coppola had not acted inappropriately toward her, but another came forward to confirm that she had felt harassed by Coppola and sued the filmmaker and others in Georgia for civil battery, civil assault, and negligent failure to prevent sexual harassment. Coppola then sued Variety for libel for publishing the video. You can read the suit online. It's a bizarre document that argues Variety is jealous of his genius and lists his filmmaking credentials as proof of his credibility, like as if winning an Oscar were somehow proof one is incapable of abuse, which I think we know is famously not true. In the midst of all of this, Lionsgate released a trailer seemingly meant to mitigate unenthusiastic reviews coming out of Cannes. Many of Coppola's films were not appreciated in their time, so the trailer provided quotes from nasty old critics who simply got it wrong, as if to say, well, actually, critics are just idiots, so yeah, maybe you saw some bad reviews, but just ignore them and go see the movie, which is an awesome, fun premise. Now, maybe you noticed that some of the quotes were a little suspicious, like, The Godfather immediately struck me as funny because, well, I guess I didn't understand why Coppola was framing himself as misunderstood for that film specifically and not Rumblefish or something. The Godfather, the highest grossing film of 1972 that broke a bunch of box office records, that was nominated for 11 Oscars and won 3, including Best Picture. You know, that undervalued movie. Well, it turns out Pauline Kael never said that The Godfather was diminished by its artsiness. Actually, oops, she loved it, writing, if ever there were a great example of how the best popular movies come out of a merger of commerce and art, The Godfather is it. Clearly, someone had been told the marketing plan was to focus on Coppola's reputation as a misunderstood genius, didn't have a clue about the actual history, typed "give me negative reviews" into ChatGPT or whatever, and never checked if what it spat out was correct. I'm not being cynical, this is literally what happened. They found a fall guy for this situation, but let's be honest, a lot of people had to see that trailer before it was released, and no one noticed. I include these things not because I want to farm drama, but because they are now a part of the history of this film. They situate Megalopolis within a changing industry, an industry embracing a technology that, though flawed, increasingly looks like it will shape the future of cinema, and an industry still attempting to reckon with and course-correct its legacy of powerful men given a blank check to behave however they want. What is utopia here? Willful ignorance of history for convenience's sake? Leadership without accountability? Doesn't sound like it to me. Broadly speaking, these conversations about the rollout have now given way to a discussion about the film itself now that it's released. It recently premiered at TIFF and Cannes and will soon arrive in theaters in the United States. Oh yeah, by the way, everything in this video up until this point was written and recorded before I saw the film. I don't know how to prove this, but it's true. Having lived in Coppola's Megalopolis brain for a little over 2 weeks now, I think I'm probably more prepared than the average moviegoer to see this film, and I still have no idea what to expect. I've done some broad social listening to get a sense of where people generally landed after its premieres, but I have intentionally not read reviews and attempted to avoid any spoilers beyond what was included in articles from decades past. I want to be as surprised as possible. That said, I want to summarize where I've landed after all of this research so you know the mindset with which I will be reviewing this film. I think the Cataline-Coppola connection will be obvious given the similarities he himself has outlined, but I also wonder if it's going to feel a bit muddled overall. He's a big picture guy. He likes to muse about big questions. Sometimes it's super fascinating, and sometimes it feels incredibly rambly and unfocused.
If there was a Martian who came down to Earth and said, you humans have this kind of thing you call consciousness. We don't think we have it. We're a person with only one eye, and you would only see, length and width. Does that mean that while you're thinking, you're also thinking that you're thinking? And I said, yeah, it's sort of like that.
Utopia is a huge topic and has the potential to read as vague and naive. As I hinted at earlier, more than just the Cataline conspiracy inspired Megalopolis. In a statement to Vanity Fair, Coppola recently listed additional inspirations such as Studio 54, Maria Bartiromo, New York City's financial crisis, and everything I have ever read or learned about. I am curious how that will translate into a central thesis, if it does at all. Overall, I'm just excited to see it. I want to know what scared off distributors. It brings to mind this quote from 2001, the first time Coppola had seriously attempted to make the film. The real question about Megalopolis isn't which of Coppola's stable of actors will be cast, or how many of his blood relatives will be on the production team. It's whether Megalopolis will be good Coppola, bad Coppola, or bold yet fatally flawed Coppola. The question still stands. Which one will it be? On September 27th, I headed down to the Regal on Delancey Street in New York City to finally see Megalopolis. When the credits rolled, I headed to Essex Market for some lunch at Mille Nonna, because what is Megalopolis but Italian food made with commitment? I imagine if anyone happened to spot me eating lunch that day, I would have looked something like this. Truly just trying to figure out what I thought about the film I'd just seen. The meatballs were great, by the way, check them out. Megalopolis was both exactly what I thought it would be and as confounding as everyone made it sound, full of inexplicable and surprising choices that provoked, confused, and humored, but never bored me. As I see it, Megalopolis is the apotheosis of auteurism. Unrestrained spectacle that amplifies Coppola's best and worst instincts on a massive scale. Although I expected Coppola to draw a connection between himself and the revisionist Cataline, I wasn't prepared for how extensively he would develop that link. Not to toot my own horn, but when there was a whole-ass title card that said debt, I almost jumped out of my seat. I said earlier that he likes to quote his own interviews in his screenplays, and sure enough, plenty of Caesar's ideology mirrors Coppola's exactly. That you find utopia through asking questions, that you should ask for forgiveness, not permission, and on and on and on. Echoes of Coppola's creative process also appear throughout the film. The architects engage in what looks like a ground is lava exercise for a theater troupe, climbing atop each other across the room. Kids run freely around Caesar's office, playing with and among his models for his new city. In that scene and throughout the film, with the birth of Sunny Hope, Megalopolis demonstrates an earnest belief in crafting a better world for children.
You really are the future. And in our relationship with Zoetrope, we're going to treat you as that.
Family has always been key to Coppola's practice thematically. Although Eleanor Coppola, his wife, and Fred Roos, his longtime producing partner, both passed away after the film's completion, their respective deaths add, in retrospect, a palpable grief to Caesar's longing for his deceased wife. But of course, this wouldn't be a Coppola film if his literal family members weren't involved too. The usual suspects make an appearance, but in case you missed it, Sofia Coppola's daughter Romy was in the film as a journalist from Dingbat News, which was the name of the newspaper Sofia made with her friends as a kid. It's also the name of the school newspaper in New York Stories, the short film he made with Sofia when she was a teenager.
You'll be on the cover of Dingbat News.
Even when this film is at its silliest, Coppola can't help but inject genuine affection into it. That said, Coppola's focus on the family underscores the film's odd politics, which constantly waver between traditionalism and progressivism. Caesar proposes a revolutionary agenda in some ways, envisioning a sustainable society in which the environment responds to a person's wants and needs, and in which the government takes a more explicitly humanist stance. At the same time, the film is also eager to preserve the nuclear family and the institution of marriage, while taking a somewhat reactionary point of view on so-called cancel culture. The bloodthirsty public just can't wait to jump on this poor man for his sexual exploits. But ha ha ha, he was framed. Don't you all feel bad for assuming the worst now? This represents the limits of working within Coppola's ideology and experience. Caesar's utopia cannot be anything more specific than what Coppola understands utopia to be, which means the concept has been mostly defined by reading philosophers who have been dead for thousands of years, and not by talking to regular people. Average, everyday citizens are reduced to mostly cartoonish, easily persuadable mobs who Caesar exhibits no interest in engaging with unless he's giving a speech. He just intuitively knows, I guess, what the ideal society requires to function. A version of Wells's benevolent dictatorship. The film's disengagement with regular folks and their concerns also contributes to a somewhat lackluster finish. Ultimately, Coppola seems to want to A, point out the preciousness and value of humanity, and B, spur a serious debate about society's future. Simple enough, although the ostensibly rousing speech Caesar gives at the end of the film essentially amounts to a teary, "Can't we all get along?" This is not an unwelcome message per se, but at a time when audiences are aching for leaders with specific ambitious agendas, one can understand why it underwhelms. Personally, I was briefly stirred by it before recognizing its loftiness and readjusting my short-lived optimism. As an actor, Adam Driver's best trait seems to be that he's down for anything. His resume boasts an impressive number of offbeat passion projects from legendary auteurs, suggesting he truly values the creative experiences he has with these filmmakers. That seems to be the case for Megalopolis. I can't say that his performance necessarily did anything special for me, but his flexibility and commitment were on admirable display here. Generally speaking, some actors fared better under Coppola's direction than others. Aubrey Plaza, for example, has a background in improvisation and thrived when she could lean on that, particularly in comedic moments. Jason Schwartzman leaned on the monotone, irreverent delivery he uses in Wes Anderson films, which must be a force of habit at this point. Giancarlo Esposito seemed to be having the time of his life hamming it up, and Lawrence Fishburne was Lawrence Fishburne. For me, Nathalie Emmanuel drowned the most in her role, never bestowing Julia with a spirit all her own. Although I don't think that's entirely her fault, because the female characters in this film have a shocking lack of interiority. I do wonder how much those characters were edited since the film's original conception in the early 1980s, because they very much fit into the archetypes from that time period. Plaza's neo-noir femme fatale, Emmanuel's morally righteous but slightly bland romantic lead, and thus they disappoint in similar ways. Aesthetically, the film is possibly the oddest visual mishmash I have ever seen. Nothing is consistent, and yet nothing seems to have happened by accident. The details are bold and unapologetic enough to feel mostly intentional. Sometimes they're comical. The NRPD made me laugh, as did Tempest magazine. Sometimes they're frustratingly predictable. Caesar's architecture resembles the amorphous, slick designs you'd see at any Future of Design exhibition. Less generously, you could say they resembled the Utopia meme. But the sheer number of curious choices kept me engaged, trying to make sense of this world as it evolved before me. Time is a major theme here, given Caesar's superhero-like ability to stop it, but it's also an element in the art direction, which features so many strange incongruities in time. QR codes at a coliseum, a Shakespearean monologue in an industrial warehouse, Latin dialogue, and Marcus Aurelius quoted in surreal futuristic environments. There are also some genuinely beautiful shots of New York City, which I'm almost positive come from the 2001 shoot, including brief shots of Ground Zero. These aesthetics and their willful disregard of typical dystopian or sci-fi norms, for me, set Megalopolis apart from another self-funded passion project that was released this year. Kevin Costner's Western saga, Horizon. Horizon purports to tell the real story of the American West, but traffics largely within the expected conventions of the genre. Megalopolis, intentionally or not, defies genre altogether. For as much as people claim the film is incomprehensible, narratively speaking, it's pretty straightforward. The innovation Coppola aspired to, unfortunately, would not come to pass. As he did with electronic cinema in the 1980s, Coppola again considered a live element to Megalopolis. Originally, he told Screen Slate, there was a section in the film after the satellite crashes when suddenly the house lights would go on and a guy would come up to the front with a microphone as if the audience was going to be told, sorry, we're not going to continue the movie because there's been this calamity. Again, not surprised this was ditched after 9/11. In 2021, he pitched another idea to Amazon, a custom version of Alexa installed in specific theaters so that audiences would have the opportunity to ask Adam Driver's character a question about what had transpired in the movie so far, and Alexa would choose the most relevant answer from a pre-approved list. In theory, you could see Megalopolis 5 times in its opening week, and it would be different each time. Amazon actually agreed to develop the technology and then laid off thousands of workers from its Alexa team, and the project was canned. The pre-recorded answers, however, were filmed. What remains is the movie's wow moment, which stunned audiences in Cannes at its first public screening. In a news conference scene, someone physically stands next to the screen and asks Caesar a question. Adam Driver actually suggested this to replace Coppola's original idea after the Alexa ordeal forced him to cut the gimmick. When I saw it, the question was baked into the screening. There was no live actor recruited to stand in. That said, the plot is winding and complex, full of roads that lead nowhere and unresolved questions. Pull at any thread and you threaten to undo its fragile structure. And yet, for such a plot-heavy film, I'm disinclined to judge it on those terms. The film isn't about the fraught relationship between Caesar and Claudio as much as it is about idealists taking a stand against opportunistic demagogues, for example. It is, more than anything, a fabulistic expression of hope. The only plot detail that really stood out to me after writing this essay was how Coppola changed Cataline's fate. Historically, Catiline led his fellow rebels into battle, where they were met with a violent death. Megalopolis, however, ends with Caesar Catalina's vindication. He successfully persuades his naysayers and the people of New Rome to follow his vision. Megalopolis is Cataline's success in the film. It is Coppola's success in real life. He too has received his vindication, finally sidestepping the film industry altogether to create an even more giant, daring, more undistributable film than One from the Heart. And this time, it didn't ruin him. Ultimately, I think 2 things are true. 1, you should see this movie for yourself. Go in with an open mind and see where you land on it. It really isn't like anything else that's in theaters right now. You might enjoy it, you might hate it, but you will feel something, and I'd argue that's a much more interesting way to spend your time. 2, I don't even know that a conventional review of this film matters. People love to tout how little box office revenue this film has made, as if Coppola should be embarrassed by it. But I don't think that insult is hitting him where it hurts at all. When Francis Ford Coppola says that money doesn't matter to him, that he just wanted to make this movie, that he likes it and he's glad he did it, I believe him. Rich people love to stay rich, and you don't spend money like that unless you really mean it. And Coppola has shown again and again, decade after decade, that he really means it. Coppola once said, I only have one regret, one real personal decision I regret, which is not making One from the Heart the way I had planned to. The other regret isn't mine alone, but my amazing generation, which didn't leave the cinema in a better condition for the next generation. Megalopolis is a way to address both. The film certainly isn't saving cinema by any means, but I do believe its audacity is a welcome jolt to the system. No one expresses love for cinema as operatically as Francis Ford Coppola, and flawed as Megalopolis is, it is a testament to that passion and to his ambition to create. Fame and success are such a mixed bag. Francis Ford Coppola probably had one of the strongest filmmaking streaks of all time in the 1970s, undeniably making him a success story. But it's not always so clear-cut. Would Coppola have been treated differently, maybe more gently, by the press if such an enormous legacy weren't constantly hovering over his head? These are the kinds of complexities Sean Nelson is exploring in his new podcast, The Wonder of It All, which takes a deep dive into the blessings and curses of success. He'll be talking to actors and musicians like John Hodgman and Lena Hall about the ways their lives and careers were shaped by a conspicuous breakthrough in both good ways and bad. You can listen and watch right now on Nebula. You know, I really left this video admiring the way that Coppola has tried to foster environments where artists have creative freedom, because I know how rare that is. Most major companies that make money off of creative people would rather you follow formulas and replicate what's already popular. They don't care about encouraging experimentation or developing creative skill sets. They just want you to publish something clickable so they can run an ad on it. Hell, some of them would rather get rid of the artist altogether. Just use AI to recycle all those old ideas and take in all that money, baby. So I'm being 100% sincere when I say that making this video also underscored for me how lucky we are to have a platform like Nebula that encourages creators like myself to take bold leaps, to be as nerdy as they want, and make their dream project without running a single ad on any of it. Everything on Nebula, like all of the great originals, is paid for with subscriptions, so signing up for the platform directly supports my channel tremendously, as well as an entire community of creators. Nebula is creator-founded and creator-led. We support each other, and in turn, hopefully, make something for you to enjoy. If you sign up using the link in my description, nebula.tv/BeKindRewind, you will not only support me directly, but also get Nebula for 40% off an annual plan. Right now, Nebula is also offering lifetime memberships. For a one-time $300 fee, you get lifetime access to everything on the streaming service for as long as Nebula exists. You never have to think about managing your subscription again. Every new episode, premiere, series, and class will be instantly at your fingertips. Why not check out the first episode of The Wonder of It All, for example, with Adam Duritz of The Counting Crows? So go to nebula.tv/BeKindRewind and check out the fascinating stories on The Wonder of It All by clicking the link in my description and signing up now.
The movies that I got to make in the 70s, we were just running too fast for anyone to stop us. Yeah. We never got permission to start on those movies. We just sort of started, and by the time they realized what we were doing, we already had those films in production. And it wasn't so much that it was a great time, but it was they hadn't yet gotten their middle management in place. They control movie making. It's very hard to run away from them now because they have such a big army of people watching you. If it's an assignment, as The Godfather was, well, I'll learn a lot from doing this. And I used to use every film as a kind of experiment and saying, someday when I get back to doing my own personal films, hopefully from personal screenplay, I'll then have done all these experiments and I'll be able to utilize what I've learned.